Kyle Dubas takes back one of his own as Wes Clark, Maple Leafs director of amateur scouting, leaves Toronto and heads to Pittsburgh. What does this mean for the Maple Leafs? We'll discuss that and more on today's edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Leafs podcast, a daily Maple Leaf centered podcast hosted by myself, Mike DiStefano, and my co-host, Dave Morassutti. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sport stops sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster, a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. What's going on, Dave? How you feeling on a Wednesday?
Well, obviously, it's a little bittersweet seeing Canada's run at the Copa America come to an end.
Oh,
but
it's not over. They can still go out there and battle for third.
Chance to get a guaranteed medal comes to an end. They still have a chance to get third.
Correct.
But it's also very tough. Argentina's tough. Colombia or Uruguay won't be any easier.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're Canada to get to where they are. I mean, it's impressive for them to even be in this position. It's somewhere they've never been able to get to. Obviously, this is the furthest that they've come in any major soccer tournament ever. So it's impressive, and they took Argentina and Messi to the brink twice. I thought they were competitive in that game for sure. They had their fair share of chances, just couldn't convert. Even had two really good chances in like the final 10 minutes of the game. But hey, when you're playing against the refs, it's tough to win soccer games, brother. Like there's nothing that is easier to fix than a soccer match. And I'm not saying that the refs fixed the match, but I will say that it did seem to be a very one-sided game when it came to the officiating. That's just from my opinion and from what my eyeball saw and the two other people I was watching the game with. I don't know what you saw, but that's kind of how I saw it.
I'll say that there were certainly calls that did not look favorable towards Canada, but there are other reasons why they lost that game. Unfortunately,
for sure, two things can be true though, right?
Yes, yeah.
Two things can be true. It was terribly officiated, and they also didn't play their best. Two things can certainly be true. Let's get into what we want to talk about today, because there's actually some pretty big news that literally dropped, maybe 15 minutes after we recorded yesterday's show. It did not take very long at all for this news to circulate. There was a report from Elliot Friedman saying, word is Wes Clark leaving the Toronto Maple Leafs, the director of player personnel and director of amateur scouting, and said, keep an eye on Pittsburgh, maybe a reunion with Dubas. Literally 3 minutes later, the Pittsburgh Penguins send out a tweet that they have hired Wes Clark as their director of amateur scouting and vice president of player personnel. So he gets a nice little promotion, and he reunites with old Kyle Dubas out in Pittsburgh. What'd you make of that move?
Well, obviously, you don't like seeing someone that plays a very important role of the organization just, leave. That's it hurts. And also seeing that he goes to Pittsburgh definitely does not help as well, considering he's not the first member of the organization to leave to go to Pittsburgh. There were a couple of others, but it also just reminds just how I'm a little curious as to why it happened now rather than a year ago when Dubas settled into Pittsburgh. Like a little after, I would have thought that a move like this would have happened like a month after the draft, like sort of like how this one happened.
Yeah,
but it took a year and a bit.
The timing is a little odd. It definitely is a little odd, and maybe it's because Dubas, maybe didn't have the pull. I don't know, like early in the year, or they had somebody else in place that they liked potentially, and they weren't willing to move off from him, and that position wasn't available. Possibly, I couldn't tell you. It is kind of strange, and even the timing now is also kind of strange, considering that Wes Clark reportedly was at player development camp for the Maple Leafs over the past weekend. So you go from 2 days, or you go from 4 days where you're at development camp, you're watching the players who you scouted and are here, you're watching develop, and you're having a good time, you're enjoying it. And then 2 days later, you say, "Peace out. I'm going to Pittsburgh. Adios, amigos." It is very strange how it all kind of went down. I don't know. Like it's you can't really tell how much of an influence a guy like Wes Clark and people in his position truly have, I guess, just because it is so behind the scenes and you don't know exactly how much is he should be credited for or how much he should be blamed for whatever's going on with the Maple Leafs and their drafting. Obviously, the last 3 years, he has become the main guy in Toronto as the director of amateur scouting. But over the course of those last 3 years, Dave, I mean, the Leafs have had some pretty good drafts. Like there hasn't been a whole lot of opportunity, I guess you could say. There hasn't been a lot of draft picks, but the ones that they've had in his tenure have been pretty good. Like I think Wes Clark has done a pretty solid job in his role, and I think this is a loss for the Maple Leafs organization.
Well, that's it, right? Like we've always kind of said, like, where are some of the draft picks, right? And it's not the first round picks, not the second round picks. Where are those third, fourth, fifth round picks? Like, eventually, you got to start hitting on a couple of them. You're not going to hit on every single one. That's one thing, right? You're not going to hit on every single one, but you're seeing teams find a way to get those other players to be contributors in their lineup, right? And I think for the Leafs here, that's something that was sorely missing. Not having those players later in the draft, right? Really come in and have an impact, right? Now, is that also just kind of a flavor of maybe the coaching staff and the development staff didn't exactly play a role in the role that they're supposed to be to get those guys up to speed? There's a lot of layers to it. It's not just the scouts did a bad job drafting.
Well, where are you referring to when you say this? Like, which years are you referring to?
I'm looking at the years where the Leafs stockpiled all these picks in 2015 and 2016.
Okay.
Right.
So what does that have to do with Wes Clark, though?
It's not what I'm not saying it's Wes Clark. It's just showing where the organization needed to shift. And he sort of came in and started to provide a little more that I can see the path of more players from when Wes Clark joined.
Okay,
Like,
so you're coming at this from you're pro Clark with this take.
I am. I just saw more from Wes Clark in his time. Now maybe that's a little bit of a recency bias, but I just know, like, looking back at pre-Clark, when now again, I know Clark's been here for a bit, but pre-Clark versus now, when he took over, you could see that there was a bit of a shift in how the scouting staff, where they kind of lean towards in their picks, right?
Yeah.
Like, you look at these, Mike's got on the screen right now, he's showing the years from like 2016 and
We go back
like
to when really everything changed, right? 2014, this is when the Shannon plan started. Here in
Yes.
2014, right? Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether it's speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because at eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. I mean, Nylander, that was a hit. Sure, it's a first-round pick. But Valiev, nothing. JJ Pinchinich, nothing. Now, Dakota Joshua turned into something, but it wasn't with Toronto. He went elsewhere and then later became a pretty solid NHLer. And they did turn Pierre Engvall into a pretty good, seventh-round pick, turning out 318 career games. And he's got himself a nice, fat little contract out in New York. But then you look at the following draft, 2015, outside of Mitch Marner, you got nothing, right? Travis Dermott. Remember Jeremy Bracco? How excited people were about Jeremy Bracco and what he was going to be able to do for the Maple Leafs. Big time offensive wing and prospect. Not even a single game played. Now, I think there were some off-ice issues with Jeremy Bracco. But what about Andrew Nielsen? People thought Andrew Nielsen was going to be a total stud. Didn't turn out to be that case. Dirkle, I mean, just look down the list. They got nothing out of this 2015 draft. Out of the 2016 draft, again, basically nothing outside of Matthews. Then now Joseph Woll is coming into his own with this team. So you got Matthews and Woll here, which is tremendous in 2016. But then 2017, the only player from this 2017 draft, and they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 selections. The only player to play a single game for them was Timothy Liljegren. And Liljegren is a player who, we're not sure what they think about this guy because he consistently sitting in the penalty box in the press box in the playoffs. So, no other player that they drafted had a single game played. And then all of a sudden you start to see things kind of shift a little bit because this is when Kyle Dubas took over here in 2018 and he drafts Rasmus Sandin. He drafts Sean Dursey and he, is in part of this draft here and the people who he put in place. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, did Wes Clark come back to the team at this point? Yes, in 2018, 2019, Wes Clark came and he was the assistant director of player personnel. So that was in the 18-19 draft. So that would have been the Nicholas Robertson draft. So the year they took Nick Robertson, Nick Abruzzese, this is, I guess, when he came back into the organization. And then the year where he took over and became, look at this 2020 draft. They haven't had a single player play an NHL game in the 2020 draft. That is unbelievable. But the year that he took over, and this is where I see a lot of people online going and saying, oh, well, what has this guy done? He's done absolutely nothing. They have no prospects outside of, Minton and Cowan. What prospects do they have? And it's like, yeah, but those are the only prospects he's really even drafted. Like he's only been here and been in his role as the director of player personnel just for 3 drafts. That's all Wes Clark has been, the head honcho. So you look and all of a sudden you look at just the 2 drafts, I guess we can really look at here is 2022, Fraser Minton. We like him as a prospect, do we not?
Yep.
Nick Moldenauer, we like him as a prospect, do we not?
Yep, from everything I've heard.
Right? Dennis Hildeby has played some excellent hockey since being drafted, came over to the AHL, put up some pretty good numbers. We think he could possibly be part of this goaltending future, at least in a backup capacity at the very least. So you got yourself a decent goaltender who you like midway through in the 4th round here. Nikita Grabankin, not enough people know how good this player is in the season he had in the KHL, not in the Russian Junior League, in the KHL, the men's league. The guy had like 40-something points. He had like 20 goals this year as a 20-year-old in the KHL. That doesn't happen very often. And he has become a nice, big two-way force, 6'2", 195 pounds. He's added an edge to his game. He can score. Grabankin's coming overseas this year. He's going to be playing in the American League to adjust the North American ice surface. People are going to understand who Grabankin is this year when they get to lay his eyes on him. I think he's a really solid diamond in the rough type of player find that they got there in the 5th round. And that was in the first year that Wes Clark, took over. So that's another solid pick. But I think like Easton Cowan is kind of the big pick there that he can really, really write home about and say, hey, this is a guy who I believed in and I stuck my neck out for him. No one else thought that Easton Cowan was worthy of a first round pick. We did. I thought that he was going to definitely turn out to be a solid player. And look what happened. A year later, wins OHL MVP in the regular season, in the playoffs. And he's now this team's number one prospect and a top prospect in hockey in general, one of the top prospects in hockey. So, and that's not to mention the big upside that Noah Chadwick has after a monstrous season in the WHL. He was one of the biggest risers, we could call them, on, the prospect list for the Maple Leafs. That was a 6th-round pick. So when we look at the drafts that he's been the lead guy, where he's been making the main decisions, things look pretty solid for Wes Clark and the Maple Leafs to this point.
Yeah, that's the thing with you see where the improvement in trying to get guys that are closer to being NHL ready. Like, the reason why I was hiring him is because I always said the part of the reason why the Leafs rebuild hasn't gone the way it should have is because those drafts prior, the 2015, 2016, those foundation years where you had the opportunity to really hone in on your drafting and developing, did not work. And you give Clark a little more credit because this is a team that every year was trading a first-round pick, trading a bunch of picks to try to make a push to win. So when you do that to a scouting staff, they can only do so much with so little.
Yeah.
And I think that's always the toughest part for a scouting staff, when you don't have those guaranteed, surefire picks to really load up and throw out there.
And even this year, he had a 1st-round pick, but didn't pick again until the 4th round. So no 2nd rounder, no 3rd rounder. Like, didn't give the scouting staff a lot of high quality darts. There's some flyers there in the 5th and 7th round. You ended up grabbing 6 players or 3 players in each of those rounds. But in terms of the quality of prospect, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for him and his scouting staff. So we'll see what comes of that. But I would say the 3 drafts that he was in charge of as the director of amateur scouting, I guess this one remains to be seen. They were just drafted like 2 weeks ago. We have no idea what to make of them. But the early returns on Cowan and Chadwick, 2 of the 3 picks in last year's draft, and the early returns on 4 of the 5 players in the 2022 draft, you got to be happy with that hit rate to this point. We'll see, obviously. You always need to see it at the NHL level, but so far, so good. But now he's not here. He's in Pittsburgh, and he's taking his talents out to Pennsylvania. I think it's a bit of a loss for the Maple Leafs. I think that he's a talented scout. He's got a good eye for hockey. And Kyle Dubas knows it. Obviously, he was a Sioux guy, so he's always known Kyle Dubas, and he's always been a Dubas guy. And going to Pittsburgh was something that obviously, was something he planned on doing at some point. Joining Kyle in Pitt, and he'll be one of Kyle's guys. And it's the way it's gonna be. There's a sense of loyalty there between those two. You get that. And even like Wes Clark, like, he shared a tweet earlier today, which I thought was kind of funny. Basically showing, actually, I think we have it, right? Don't we have that tweet?
Why don't we can look at that maybe in the next segment.
Okay, we'll take a break. We'll come back, and then we'll show that tweet, and what does it mean for the Leafs afterward? That's coming up next here on the Locked On Leafs podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop, but as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and all the sports aren't sports and like I want them to. FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I got to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. Mike DiStefano and Dave Morassutti with you here. And just a reminder, we do have a daily Maple Leafs podcast coming at you each and every day. New episodes Monday through Friday, wherever you can find your podcast at. Also up on YouTube. So Wes Clark gone, director of player personnel for the Maple Leafs. He is now in Pittsburgh, joining forces with the dark side. Gone, joining forces with Kyle Dubas. And yeah, we were referencing this tweet that he sent out pretty much right as soon as it got announced that he was leaving. And I thought it was kind of cheeky. Why don't we listen to the quote? I think this is from a podcast or something. But I thought it was very telling. Kind of the audio here.
You read the quote once more. Don't eat with people you wouldn't starve with. To me, like, loyalty is really big. Because then if you invest in certain people in your life and they stick by you and you stick by them, what else is life about?
And that was it. That was his response, along with, happy to be in Pittsburgh. So obviously him and Dubas, right? There's a sense of loyalty that goes back to the Sioux. Brought Wes Clark into Toronto, and now he's bringing him out to Pittsburgh. And that's where he's going to be. And he's got a nice new shiny title, good contract. I'm sure he's making some good chunk of change, and he's going to do what he does best. And he's now going to be a big time scout for Dubas once again, but this time out in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there's like a very similar train of thought to both Dubas and Clark, kind of like that philosophical, like the loyalty thing. It reminds you a lot about the Jason Spezza. Like, as soon as Dubas wasn't brought back, Spezza was pretty much like, I'm not sticking around either. I'm gone. I'm going with him as well. There's a little bit of that. But again, it also just kind of, as I said before, just so strange that it didn't happen right away that Clark left.
Do you read anything into that, by the way? The fact that guys are like, I'm gonna follow Kyle instead of, I like what Shanny's doing, let's stick with this plan. Instead, you got guys who are jumping ship and following Kyle to Pittsburgh. Like, do you read into that at all?
No, I don't know if it's more of a Shanny thing and more so like maybe Kyle just promising things that maybe these guys. Wait, when you get bringing I think it might be more of a Brad Living thing than a Shanahan thing.
Yeah.
Right? Because we already know that when you bring in a new general manager, they like to bring in guys that they know and can trust. Now,
but if I'm not mistaken, Spezza left before Tree was coming.
Yeah, that one was purely Spezza and Dubas spent a lot of time together. I think that was just more so Spezza also saying, I got this role here in Pittsburgh. We can groom you to be our next general manager. Because I feel like that's always how it was going to be with Kyle Dubas. I think that situation was more like that. Because I don't think Brandon Shanahan was going to give Spezza really any sort of title like that, especially under True Living. So I think with the other staff, eventually guys start to be like, okay, eventually True Living is going to bring in some of his people. I'm also surprised we haven't seen a lot of that happen. We saw a little bit of it. We haven't really seen a whole lot of it. But yeah, like I think there's a little bit of both, like guys who, probably liked working under Kyle and things that Kyle had done. But again, yeah, like these sort of things do happen when there's such a shift. I just don't know how much of that is a Brad Living thing or if it's a Shanahan thing. It's it's tough to really gauge sometimes, like which moves.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess like the next and obvious question, and well, it's not an obvious answer, is where the Leafs go from here. Now they're in need of a new director of amateur scouting and a player personnel executive. And is this a job you expect for them to probably fill internally at this point then?
Yeah, I mean, like when we talked about players, people that were brought in by Brad Living, there is one. He was hired not too long after Brad Living was hired, and that was Derek Clancy. So he was hired as an assistant general manager of player personnel. And he's talking about like talent evaluators and things like that. I think he was with the Canucks and he oversaw their pro and amateur scouting. So to me, that seems like the natural, and I think a couple of Leaf reporters have also said like this seems like the next, like the transition would be to just bring in Clancy, to promote Clancy into that role, because he has done that role before, and he also did it with the Penguins when they won 3 Stanley Cups.
He did do it with the Penguins, and actually the Calgary Flames. He did work 1 year as a pro scout for the Calgary Flames under Brad Treliving. I'm guessing that's where their relationship started a couple of years ago. Yeah, the only thing, and I don't know the answer to this question. It could not really matter at all. But when he was in Pittsburgh, he was the director of professional scouting. I know there's a big difference between pro scouts and amateur scouts, right? Like there is, and that is the director of amateur scouting is the role that Wes Clark vacates. So, can Derek Clancy fill in that role? Like, is he familiar enough with what's going on in the minor leagues, in the CHL and the KHL, the tier 2, the VHL or the Swedish junior leagues, where he can get up to speed that quickly? I personally do not know the answer to that, but I think those are answers that Brad Treliving would have for him if he was a guy who was possibly capable of taking over that position. So that's the only thing I think that I would maybe look at and question. Not question Derek Clancy as a guy who could fill in that role, but there is a difference between pro scouting and amateur scouting, and Derek Clancy's background is very clearly pro scouting as opposed to amateur. So I do wonder if that plays a role at some point here for him maybe not being considered, but there's he's an obvious choice if they do want to maybe put somebody possibly in that position. You also do have Reid Mitchell, who's the director of hockey and scouting operations for the Maple Leafs. Maybe he's someone who could potentially be useful for the Maple Leafs. Could he be a player or a person that they look to fill in that role at some point here? I think maybe Reid Mitchell could be an option, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm trying to think of who would have been under Wes Clark as like the assistant in this regard as well.
Yeah, it doesn't say, I guess you'd just be looking at the amateur scouts. Like, who are the big time amateur scouts for the Maple Leafs? Like, that's kind of what you'd be looking at, which let me see if they have the amateur scouts here at all.
They do have a list of all the amateur scouts, like Victor Alm, Scott Bell, Tommy Bergman, but those guys are
if we want to add it to the stage, we could share it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of names here. I mean, I know some people will recognize Jim Vesey's name, but I just don't know if any of those qualify under the director position, right? Maybe there is. Maybe there's an opportunity for someone there.
This name here, if I'm not mistaken, Chris Roque, I believe he was referenced by Wes Clark as one of their top scouts. Chris Roque, when they were talking about one of the players, I can't remember exactly who it was, but he talked about like Roque, one of our top scouts, was really high on him, and I think it was one of their picks in the 5th round or something like that. Maybe it was Sam McHugh, or I think that's what it was actually. I think it was Sam McHugh. He was really high on him. So junior scout, maybe in the OHL.
Yeah, he was one of Dubas's. He was with Dubas in the Sioux, so he could be also leaving too one day.
Oh, okay. Well, possibly then. Maybe he could end up going somewhere. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do here. I do notice that it does appear that wasn't
Jake Muzzin was a pro scout, but he is doing more player development now.
No, I know that, but it looks like he's come off of the pro scouting staff, which I find interesting because it hasn't been officially announced. Like, where is he? I'm trying to. He's not really in the player development either. anymore.
They got to do a little work on the website registry. They were too busy removing. Maybe they got too zealous and removed Muzzin, but forgot to put him back.
Possibly. That's possible, I suppose. Is he anywhere else up in here? No. Interesting. But anyway, so there's some internal options. We'll see if they decide to go with any of them, or maybe they decide to go elsewhere, to try and fill the position. But either way, Maple Leafs going to have to fill the void, and I think it'd be interesting to see. It's gotten to a point where when you cover a team like you and I do, you start to understand how they operate a little bit. Like, I'd gotten to the point where I understand Wes Clark's line of thinking. So when he makes a draft pick and he talks about them, like I understand why he's doing what he does. And, I think typically it's worked out. Now we're going to have a new man in charge. So it's going to be completely different when it comes to the scouting staff moving forward. So I'll be curious to see how things change. So it's a new GM in the last year. It's now a new coach, new scout, new head scout might be in the works. Does that mean a completely new scouting staff could potentially be, coming through here into Toronto? I don't know. We'll see. But definitely it was some interesting little piece of news to wake up to today, that Wes Clark departing Toronto, going to Pittsburgh, and there's now a pretty sizable and vacant job for the Maple Leafs and their scouting staff. We'll see what ends up happening throughout the summer at some point. We'll see. All right. Anything else you want to get into today?
No, I think it'll be interesting to see how the Leafs what the Leafs eventually do with this position, but I'm assuming they'll probably could be a outside hire coming at some point too.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Maybe there's somebody who's still out in Calgary, right? Who didn't quite leave just yet, who might be, one below and could end up looking for a promotion, and a tree living guy, perhaps. That's possible too. Very similarly to exactly what happened with the Maple Leafs and this whole situation with Dubas coming in and poaching his guy. Maybe Tree Living goes and poaches a guy from Calgary. It's possible, very possible that could happen. But that'll do it for us here today on the podcast. I'd like to thank you all for listening and supporting the show. You can subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast on all platforms and receive daily Leafs content. Follow myself on Twitter at Mickey_Canuck. Follow Dave at D_Morassutti, and follow the show as well at Locked On Leafs. We'll be back with another episode for you guys tomorrow. But until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.